They told me I would ruin the photographs just by standing in the frame. That was the last sentence my daughter ever spoke to me without lowering her voice or coating it in that brittle sweetness she reserves for others. And for years afterward, it clung to the inside of my chest, like smoke no open window could clear. My name is Eleanor. I am 78 now, and I live alone in a small house where the walls no longer echo with anyone's footsteps but my own. But on nights when the world feels too quiet, I can still hear her pronouncing that word. Ruin, like I was. A stain that might spread if anyone let me too close. I remember the moment clearly. How she didn't look at me directly. How she pretended to be scrolling through something on her phone while her fingers trembled the slightest bit. How she stood with her back half turned, as if even the idea of facing me might tarnish her wedding preparations. I remember thinking she was simply overwhelmed, that weddings make even sensible girls frantic, that surely she didn't mean it the way it sounded. And yet the way she said it had a practiced sharpness, as though she had rehearsed it in her mind, maybe even tried out different versions until she found the one that sliced the deepest while appearing civilized. I stood there in my pale blue dress, the one I'd bought secondhand but tailored for myself, with a row of delicate hand stitches along the waist, holding the silver clutch I'd borrowed from my sister. And for a moment, I simply couldn't understand that she was talking to me, the woman who held her through fevers, storms, and heartbreaks. Me, the woman who worked night shifts at the laundry so she could go to college without debt. Me, the one she once believed knew everything in the world worth knowing. She didn't want me in her wedding photos, she explained, or rather, she murmured while avoiding my eyes, because the color of my dress clashed with the bridal palette she and her fiancé had chosen. Later, she added other excuses, each one more fragile than the last. There wasn't enough seating. The photographer charged extra for large groups. The decor theme was minimalistic. All those reasons piled together like thin, brittle sticks that couldn't hide the truth beneath them. My presence embarrassed her. She didn't want her new in-laws, polished and affluent, to see the woman who raised her alone and never learned to pretend she belonged among people who valued image more than intimacy. Her final justification was delivered in a voice that trembled, not with sadness but impatience. "It's just better this way, Mom. You'll be happier at home. You won't enjoy being around strangers anyway." I nodded, because I had spent a lifetime nodding, but the nod did nothing to stop the slow sinking inside my ribs. It felt like standing on a shoreline while the tide pulled something precious out of your hands, something you weren't quick enough or strong enough to hold on to. I told her I understood. She seemed relieved. And then she went back to the mirror where she practiced her smile for the photographs I would not be in. I drove home with the radio off because silence felt kinder than pretending to listen to strangers singing about things they might actually believe in. I placed the blue dress back into its protective bag and hung it in the far end of the closet, where it still hangs today, untouched. Not because I was saving it, but because I could never find the heart to throw away the last thing I had chosen in hope. For months afterward, I lived as though I were holding my breath, expecting her to call, to soften, to say something like, "I'm sorry, Mom, I was overwhelmed." But the call never came. Instead, she sent a careful text message with a photo of herself in lace and veil, framed by glossy smiles that shone with the kind of ease people feel when they manage to erase the one inconvenient truth from the room. She didn't ask where I was during the ceremony, or whether I'd eaten, or whether the world felt too heavy around me that day. She simply sent a picture and added, "Hope you're doing well." It was a sentence that sounded like a stranger passing you on a sidewalk. And so the years went on, slow and full of a quiet ache, the kind you learn to carry the same way you carry an old scar, still shaped like the wound, but no longer bleeding, though tender whenever fingertips graze it. I learned to fill my days with predictable rituals, pruning tomato plants on the porch, baking small loaves of lemon bread I shared with neighbors, wiping down the kitchen counters even when they were already clean, humming to myself in the evenings. So the silence didn't feel like it might swallow me whole. I told myself I was fine, that distance and dignity were cousins, that my daughter was simply busy with a life she had built far from mine. I believed those lies just enough to keep moving. But sometimes, in the softest hours before dawn, I felt the truth rising through me like cold water, that I had been dismissed with a politeness sharp enough to pass for kindness, and that my daughter had allowed that dismissal to harden into a habit. I don't know when exactly I stopped expecting reconciliation. Perhaps it was the third year without a birthday call, or the fifth Christmas marked only by a generic greeting card addressed in my son-in-law's handwriting. Perhaps it was earlier, when I realized she no longer introduced me as her mother, but as my mom. She lives out of town. As if geography explained the hollow distance in her voice. What I do know is that pain, when left long enough in the dark, transforms. It becomes a kind of quiet clarity, the sort that doesn't beg or bargain, but simply acknowledges what has already happened. And that clarity brought me a different kind of peace, not joyous, not triumphant, but steady in its own way, as if my heart had finally grown tired of reaching out and learned instead to rest inside itself. Still, nothing prepared me for the sound of her knock 10 years later, sharp and unsteady against my old wooden door. Not the kind of knock people use when they come to return borrowed things or bring warm news. I wasn't expecting anyone. I wasn't expecting her least of all. When I opened the door and saw her standing there, pale and thinner than I remembered, clutching a wrinkled envelope in one hand and something even smaller in the other, it felt as though the years folded in on themselves. She looked at me, not with anger and not with love, but with an expression I couldn't decode, as if she wasn't sure whether she was seeking refuge or confession. And before I could speak, she held up the small white envelope between us like a fragile offering, her voice barely above a whisper, as she said, "Mom, I need to know something, and I don't know who else to ask." When she stepped inside, the air in the house shifted the way it does when a storm gathers at the edge of the sky, not with noise, but with pressure, with that strange heaviness that tells you something long, postponed, has finally come to collect its due. She stood in the middle of my small living room, her eyes scanning the worn rug and the fading photographs on the mantel, as though she were trying to reconcile the life I had built, without her permission, with the version of me she had preserved in her mind, the muted, pliant woman who had once agreed to disappear from the edges of her celebrations. She held the two envelopes awkwardly, like she wasn't sure which one to let me see first, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. I could hear the slow ticking of the wall clock, the soft hum of the refrigerator, and underneath it, all the tremor of her breathing. Finally, she lowered her gaze, inhaled in a way that suggested bracing, and extended the wrinkled yellow envelope toward me, murmuring something I didn't quite catch until I asked her to repeat it. She looked up then, eyes rimmed with the kind of tiredness that comes not from sleepless nights, but from living too long inside a lie that has finally begun to unravel, and said almost defiantly, "He thinks our son might not be his." It was not the sort of revelation you prepare for, especially not after a decade of silence. But her words did not shock me the way she seemed to expect. Perhaps because life had already trained me to expect that the blows landing late are often the ones shaped by choices made long before. Or perhaps because the pain of losing my place in her life had carved out a spaciousness inside me. A hollow, where new injuries found no untouched surface to bruise. I gestured for her to sit, though she remained standing a moment longer, staring at the framed photograph of her as a child clutching a fishing pole beside the lake where we once spent an entire summer catching nothing but mosquito bites and laughter. She swallowed, and her voice dropped lower when she said, "He's asked for a test. He says he won't stay married if I don't agree." I waited, knowing she had not come for my sympathy, but for something sharper. Something only truth could deliver. She set the second envelope, the small white one, on the table like a hidden blade finally revealed. When she spoke again, her words trembled with a mixture of desperation and resentment. "These," she tapped the envelope with 2 fingers, "are the results, but I haven't opened them yet. I needed to talk to you first." I realized then that the test itself was not the catalyst, not really. What brought her to my doorstep was the collapse of the curated world she had spent her adult life constructing, a world built so carefully on selective truths and omissions that any intrusion, even the possibility of biological uncertainty, threatened to expose the hollowness beneath its polished surface. She had come to me not because she trusted me, but because she feared what the truth might reveal about her, about the marriage she had defended with such rigidity, about the family image she had protected even at the cost of shredding the bond between us. And yet beneath that fear was something even more brittle. Shame. Not shame for any act she might have committed, but shame for the version of herself she had become. A woman so consumed with appearing impeccable that she had exiled the very person who could have steadied her when the ground finally crumbled. She finally sat down across from me, clutching her handbag so tightly her knuckles blanched. The silence thickened, not hostile, but heavy, like clay waiting for hands brave enough to shape it. She began to speak in fits and starts, explaining how the tension with her husband had been mounting for years, how small disagreements had ballooned into full-throated arguments, how the life she had presented to the world had gradually become a fragile performance she no longer had the strength to maintain. She admitted, almost in a whisper, that there had been a stretch of time during her engagement when she had felt lost, suffocated by expectations she didn't know how to meet, and that she had once, for a brief and regrettable night, sought comfort from someone she had known before her marriage. She didn't describe the moment, but the tremor in her voice revealed its weight. She said she had convinced herself it didn't matter because she was certain it hadn't changed anything, because the timing still aligned with her life as she intended it to be. She clung to that belief the way drowning people cling to driftwood. Even as the years passed, and she avoided looking too closely at her son's face, at the angles of his jaw, at the shape of his eyes, afraid that her husband might see a question she herself refused to articulate. When she finished, she leaned back, the confession sinking into the room like a stone into deep water. She waited for me to react, perhaps expecting anger, judgment, or the self-righteous satisfaction of a wounded mother handed leverage at last. But I felt none of that. Instead, what I felt was something quieter, something weary but steady, a recognition that her choices, however flawed, had been shaped by the same fear that had once driven me to shrink myself in order to keep the peace, to make my presence small, enough that others would not resent its weight. I saw in her not a villain, but a woman who had spent her life performing strength for people who never bothered to see through the illusion, and who now, stripped of pretense, was finally confronting the fragile truth beneath it. She reached for the white envelope again, but hesitated, her fingertips brushing the edge as though it might burn. "I came to you," she said, "because I don't know what I'm supposed to hope for. If he's not his father's child, I don't know who I'll be. I don't know what will be left of my life." I wanted to tell her that identity built on the approval of others is a house with no foundation, that the years she spent running from herself had finally caught up with her, that the pain she had inflicted on me was born from the pain she had cultivated within herself. But I knew she wasn't ready for that truth, not yet. Instead, I placed my hand gently on the table, not reaching for hers, but offering my presence like a light held at a distance, warm but not demanding. She exhaled shakily, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and whispered, "I never meant to hurt you like that." I nodded, not as forgiveness, but as acknowledgement. Because sometimes nodding is the only bridge people have when the distance has grown too wide to cross in a single step. The envelope lay between us, small and innocuous, yet containing the power to reorder her world. I realized then that this moment, the moment where truth hovered on the brink of revelation, was the true catalyst, the moment in which the past 10 years finally aligned into a single, painful clarity. She had exiled me from her life to protect an image that was never real. And now the image itself was collapsing. She looked at me with an uncertainty I had not seen in her since she was a child, scraping her knee on the sidewalk, searching my face for permission to cry. And though I did not reach out to comfort her, though I did not step back into the role she had discarded, I felt something loosen inside me. Not reconciliation, not yet, but the first shift of a long frozen ground beginning to thaw. She slid the envelope toward me, her voice low and trembling. "I need you to open it. I can't do it alone." And in that moment, I understood fully. She had not come for answers about her son's father. She had come because the life she had built without me had finally demanded a reckoning she could no longer face by herself. I did not reach for the envelope right away. Instead, I sat there looking at it as if it were some small white animal that might bolt if I moved too quickly. And in that pause, I could feel how badly she wanted this to be over, how much she longed for some abrupt, surgical moment that would slice through her fear and leave only certainty behind, whether comforting or cruel. Life rarely grants such clean incisions, but I understood the desire. I have lived long enough to know that sometimes the worst part of any truth is not the content itself, but the waiting just before it is known, the trembling space where every possible outcome exists at once, and the mind is free to torture itself with all of them. When I finally picked it up, the envelope felt lighter than I expected, almost insubstantial, but my fingers shook anyway as I ran a nail along the sealed edge. She watched my hands the way people watch a surgeon's, searching for hints of triumph or dread in the smallest movement. And when I unfolded the single sheet inside, I forced myself to read not as a mother, not as a woman already wounded by this child, but as someone whose only duty in that exact moment was to bear witness to a fact. I read the words twice, once with my eyes and once with the dull thud of my heart, and then I looked up and met her gaze. "It says he is his father's son," I told her, my voice steady in a way I did not entirely feel. For a second, she didn't seem to understand. The muscles of her face stayed taut and guarded, as if bracing for impact, and the news slid past her like water over stone. Then her shoulders sagged all at once, the tension draining out of her in a way that was almost unsettling to watch, because in that collapse I saw not just relief, but something uglier, something like disappointment, that there would be no dramatics, catastrophe to excuse all the small cruelties that had led her here. She pressed her hands over her face and began to sob. Not the deep, cleansing kind of crying that softens a person, but short, sharp bursts that sounded like they were trying to expel years of unspoken terror all at once. I waited, letting the storm of her weeping spend itself without reaching across the table, without offering tissues or soothing words, because I could sense that anything that looked like comfort from me would only confuse her more, blurring the line between what she had done and what I was now willing or unwilling to carry for her. When she finally lowered her hands, her cheeks blotchy and wet, she laughed once, a broken little sound with no humor in it, and said, "So, all of this, all these years of him looking at our son like he was a question mark, it was all in my head." I shook my head slowly and answered with an honesty that felt like pressing a bruise. "No, it wasn't all in your head. You knew what you had done, even if you tried to bury it." The doubt was real, whether or not the result turned out the way you feared. She didn't argue. Instead, she stared at the paper as though it might yet shift and rearrange its verdict. After a while, she whispered that her husband had insisted on the test only after a particularly vicious argument, one in which she had thrown his own infidelities in his face, and in retaliation, he had reached for the one weapon he suspected might exist, the rumor he had once heard from a cousin about that old boyfriend she had run into months before the wedding. It was petty and spiteful, and exactly the kind of cruelty people resort to when they have grown used to wounding each other more than they ever try to heal. The result should have been a bomb, but instead it settled over the room like a fine, choking dust. Now there would be no dramatic rupture to explain why her marriage felt hollow, no external villain to blame for the loneliness inside her own home, no clear, catastrophic event to justify the years she had spent closed off from the one person who might have told her the truth long before it came in a printed form. The test was negative for scandal, positive for paternity, and in that simple binary, she was left face to face with a more uncomfortable reality, that the emptiness in her life had not been imposed on her by fate or biology, but carefully built, brick by brick, out of her own choices and compromises. In the days that followed, the result of the test did not, as she might have once imagined, reset her world to something safe and familiar. Instead, it seemed to strip away what little pretense remained. She began calling me, not constantly, but regularly enough that my telephone, long accustomed to the silence, sounded almost startled each time it rang with her name on the small, glowing screen. At first, the calls were practical, almost transactional. She wanted to recount, in painstaking detail, her husband's reaction when she handed him the paper, how he had scanned it briefly, nodded stiffly, and then said, "Well, that's that," before going to take a shower. She thought he might apologize for having doubted her, might hold her and say they could start over. Instead, he treated the confirmation like the closing of a file in an overstuffed cabinet. She told me that in the days after, he seemed more distant than before, as though now that his worst suspicion had been disproved, he no longer had a reason to engage with her at all, even in conflict. I listened, because old habits die slowly, but I did not offer advice, and that baffled her. She kept waiting for me to slide back into the role of the reassuring mother, the woman who would tell her what to do next, how to fix it, how to smooth over the cracks in her carefully curated life. And when I did not, when I simply reflected her, words back to her without packaging them in comfort, she grew both more restless and more drawn to the conversations. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the boundaries of these calls began to shift. She would start with an update on some new argument or cold silence at home. But then, to her own apparent surprise, she would veer into small memories from her childhood, testing them out loud like someone handling delicate heirlooms they had forgotten they still owned. She asked if I remembered the winter she broke her arm falling off the sled, how I spent nights propped in a hard chair by her hospital bed so she wouldn't wake up alone in the dark. She mentioned the birthday when I made her a lopsided cake shaped like a castle, because she had declared she would be a queen someday, not understanding that rulers are often the loneliest people at the table. Each time she brought up these memories, there was a quality to her voice I couldn't entirely place, half longing, half accusation, as if she resented me for giving her something so solid and tender in a life where she had later traded that solidity for surface polish. Yet for all that, she did not apologize for the wedding, not outright. Instead, she began to reshape that moment in language, smoothing its edges, trying to tuck it into a narrative where she was overwhelmed, foolish, caught up in aesthetics, as she put it. She described the pressure from her in-laws, how they had made small, cutting remarks about my lack of sophistication the first time they met me, how she had felt cornered between them and the version of herself she wanted to present, how she had convinced herself that it would be easier for everyone if I just stayed away from the ceremony, if she could visit me later and make it up to me properly. Hearing her talk that way, trying to retrofit regret into a story that still cast her as someone with no real choice, I could feel the familiar tug in my chest, the urge to let her rewrite the script, to tell her I understood, to absolve her so she could slip back into a comfortable role. But I had changed during those 10 years, quietly and stubbornly, and while I did not throw the past at her like a weapon, I also did not allow it to vanish into soft focus. When she said, one afternoon, "You know I never meant to hurt you that day, right? I was just under so much pressure," I answered with a calmness that felt almost foreign on my tongue. "You may not have meant to, but you did." Intention doesn't change what someone has to live through. There was a long silence on the line after that, broken only by the faint echo of her breathing. I could almost hear her rearranging her thoughts, weighing whether to argue or to hang up. Instead, she surprised me by saying, in a small voice, "I don't know how to be around you if you're not forgiving me." I thought about that for a long moment before replying, "Then maybe it's time you learn how to be around someone you've hurt without expecting them to absolve you on command." That was the first real crack, the moment when the quiet escalation truly began. From there, our interactions became a peculiar dance, each step cautious but inevitable. She came to visit once, under the pretense of bringing me some documents she claimed I might need, though when she arrived the papers were trivial. Copies of insurance statements, a brochure for a medical practice near my house, things I had neither, requested, nor lacked. She looked around my living room much the way she had on the day of the test. But this time, her gaze lingered on evidence of a life she had not witnessed. A knitted blanket gifted by a neighbor, a stack of library books, a framed photo taken by one of the women from my church group, where I stood laughing with my head thrown back, unposed and unafraid of the camera. She frowned slightly, not in disapproval exactly, but in confusion, as if the image didn't match the faded caricature of me she had carried for so long. We drank tea at the small table by the window, and she asked cautious questions about my days. When I told her about the volunteer work I did at the community center, helping younger women fill out forms and write resumes, she looked almost offended. "I didn't know you were doing all that," she said, as though my life should have remained static in her absence. I smiled faintly and replied, "You didn't ask." That answer settled between us with a weight that made her shift in her chair. For the first time, she seemed to realize that while she was busy curating her life for others, I had gone on quietly, curating mine for myself, and that the distance between us was not just a wound she had inflicted, but a space I had, over time, learned to fill with things that had nothing to do with her. The more she saw that I was not waiting suspended in the past, the more uneasy she became, and that unease fueled the next layer of escalation. She began, subtly at first, to tug at the threads of my independence, making small, seemingly innocent comments about my age, my health, the way I moved a little more slowly when I stood up. She mentioned, in a tone too light to be truly casual, that the adult children of some of her friends had started helping their parents with finances and paperwork, making sure no one took advantage of them. She asked whether I had a will, whether my house was properly arranged, whether I had anyone nearby to call if I fell. The implication curled at the edges of her words like smoke, that I was vulnerable, that I needed oversight, that she might yet reclaim some authority over my life if she could position her concern as duty. I recognized the strategy, not because I thought of her as malicious, but because I had seen it so many times before in other families, other stories, like a pattern worn into the floorboards of human behavior. When someone has lost control over the narrative they built, they often turn to the most obvious remaining arena, someone else's autonomy, to prove to themselves that their influence still matters. So instead of snapping or retreating, I answered her questions plainly, listing the arrangements I had already made, the neighbor who had a spare key, the lawyer in town who had my documents on file. Each answer seemed to unsettle her further, because with every demonstration of preparedness, I was quietly refusing the role of the helpless elder she was trying to cast me in. It was in these small, accumulating moments, the phone calls laced with half-acknowledged guilt, the visits punctuated by attempts to reassert control, the way she struggled to reconcile the mother she had rejected with the woman in front of her, that the true escalation unfolded not in shouted accusations or dramatic confrontations, but in the persistent, aching friction between the version of me she needed to believe in and the reality she could no longer ignore. And as that friction grew, as she swung between seeking my steady presence and bristling at my quiet strength, I could feel something shifting deeper still, a subtle tilting of the ground beneath both our feet that would eventually force us into a reckoning neither one of us could postpone forever. In the weeks that followed her unexpected visits and halting phone calls, something within me shifted in a way I did not fully recognize at first, a slow and steady realignment that was less like a revelation and more like the gradual thaw of a long winter. I had spent so many years convincing myself that silence was the only landscape left to us, that the idea of any new beginning felt as implausible as spring arriving in a world where nothing had ever grown. Yet suddenly, I found my days widening with a strange new clarity. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, and certainly not reconciliation, but it was a kind of awakening, the realization that her return, even in its fractured and burdensome form, was not an erasure of the past, but an invitation to understand myself, apart from the wounds she had carved. I could feel something loosening in me that I hadn't anticipated, a loosening of the instinct to shrink myself, to remain quiet and small in order to preserve some fragile peace between us. I no longer felt the weight of her expectations pressing on my breath the way they had for decades. Instead, there was a cautious sense of distance I had earned through years of solitude, a distance I now held not as a barrier, but as a vantage point, from which I could finally see our history without flinching. It became clear during our conversations that she was unprepared for this new version of me, the one who answered her without tiptoeing around her emotions, who listened without absorbing her panic, who refused to collapse into the familiar script of the long-suffering mother waiting patiently for scraps of affection. She would call in the evenings, sometimes under the guise of seeking advice, but more often because the silence in her own home had become unbearable, and she spoke in circles about all the ways her marriage felt like a performance she no longer wanted to rehearse, how the test results had removed the only dramatic conflict that could have justified the misery she now felt daily, how her husband looked at her not with suspicion anymore, but with something far colder: indifference. Each time she described this, her voice wavered with frustration, as though she believed that certainty of paternity should have restored something between them, but instead it had done the opposite, revealing how little substance there had ever been. Under the polished facade of their carefully curated life, one afternoon she admitted, with a bitterness that tasted almost like envy, that she didn't understand how I could seem so calm, so anchored, when everything around her felt like it was disintegrating. She said the words with the same bewildered tone she had used when she saw my home filled with little signs of a full life: my plants, my books, my projects, my quiet contentment. And I realized then that she had imagined me frozen in time the moment. She excised me from her wedding, as though I would remain waiting in that moment like a photograph stored in a drawer, unchanged and unchanging. When I told her gently that living alone had not been a sentence, but a space I had slowly learned to inhabit with dignity, she blinked rapidly, as if the idea of me growing in her absence did not fit within the architecture of her understanding. She tried to mask the discomfort with a laugh, but the sound was brittle, breaking apart at the edges. It was during one of her visits, one she arranged spontaneously, as though compelled by a force she did not want to examine, that the midpoint of our long, painful story revealed itself. She arrived unannounced on a late afternoon drenched in heavy clouds, the kind of day where the horizon folds into itself and the air hangs humid with the threat of rain. When I opened the door, she stood on my porch holding a stack of papers and a small box that she balanced awkwardly under one arm. She stepped inside without waiting to be invited, glancing around the living room as though hoping to find something disordered or out of place, something that would confirm the narrative she was still clinging to: that I was fragile, adrift, in need of direction. Instead, she found everything as it usually was: orderly, warm, alive in a modest way. She set the box on the table with a thud that felt theatrical and announced, with an air of forced authority, that she wanted to help me organize my financial documents because she had been thinking a lot about safety and long-term planning and family responsibilities. I knew immediately that the box was an attempt to reclaim control, a symbolic gesture designed to place her back in a position where she could manage the narrative, ensuring that she was once again the adult and I the dependent. I watched her flip through my files with a nervous energy that betrayed her real motive, which was not concern but fear. Fear that I had built a life sturdy enough to exclude her. Fear that my independence might expose the hollowness in her own. She babbled about estate planning, about the risk of scams targeting the elderly, about the importance of transparency between generations, and I let her speak without interruption until she paused mid-sentence, waiting for my gratitude. Instead, I closed the folder she had opened and slid the entire stack back into the box. I told her, without raising my voice or softening the edges, that I had already arranged my affairs years ago, long before she had ever considered the possibility that she might need something from me again. I explained that my lawyer had copies of everything, that my home was in my name alone, that my bank accounts were secure, and that while I appreciated the gesture, it was unnecessary. The air between us shifted instantly, as though she had walked into a mirror and found not the reflection she expected, but a stranger looking back. Her mouth tightened, and for a moment she looked like the girl she once was. The stubborn teenager who could not bear being told no, who interpreted any boundary as a personal affront. "What are you trying to prove?" she demanded, her voice barely controlled. I met her gaze steadily and answered that I was not trying to prove anything. I was simply telling the truth. The truth, I added, was that autonomy is not a threat, and that her need to insert herself into my life was not evidence of love, but evidence of her own fear of unraveling. She stared at me as though I had struck her, and then she sank slowly into a chair, her composure collapsing in a way that was both painful and illuminating. She whispered that she didn't know how to navigate being around a mother who no longer needed her, and something inside me softened, not toward the past, but toward the vulnerability she could not hide. We sat together in a long, thick silence that was not hostile, but dense with recognition, and in that moment, the midpoint of our story revealed its gravity. For the first time, she saw me not as a mother whose life revolved around her, not as a woman waiting to be forgiven or accepted back into her daughter's arrangements, but as a person with boundaries, desires, and a life that had grown in the soil of abandonment. And I, in turn, saw her not as the architect of my pain, but as a woman confronting the collapse of the identity she had built from borrowed pride and brittle performances. It was the moment the power shifted, not from her to me, but into a balance where neither of us could pretend any longer that the past was still dictating the present. The rain began to fall then, soft at first, then with a steady insistence, and she stared at the window as if the sound might translate the emotions she could not articulate. She asked, in a voice stripped of its usual certainty, whether I believed she was a bad person. I told her I didn't think in such simple terms, that people are often shaped more by their fears than by their intentions, and that understanding does not erase damage. She absorbed this quietly, her shoulders slowly lowering, her breath evening out, and I realized that something fundamental had shifted in both of us, not toward reconciliation, but toward truth. And in that truth, a new path, narrow, unsteady, but real, began to form beneath our feet. The weeks that followed that strange afternoon unfolded with a restless energy that neither of us fully understood. It was as though the moment she finally saw me as someone with a life outside the orbit of her expectations had unsettled something inside her that had been tightly coiled for years. She called more often, her voice threading through my evenings with an urgency that felt almost feverish. But the tone of the calls began to change. Where before she had sought refuge or clarity, now she seemed to be searching for footholds, something stable she could grip as her own life slid sideways beneath her. And the more she recognized that I was not the version of me she had carefully rehearsed in her mind, the more disoriented she became. It was not reconciliation she wanted. It was reassurance that she still had a place of authority in a world that was quietly rejecting the image she had built of herself. That is when the escalation truly began. Subtle at first, like a shift in air pressure before a storm, but growing steadily into something heavier, something tangled and difficult that neither of us could pretend to ignore. She started asking questions that masked a deeper intent, inquiring about my routines, whether I walked alone in the evenings, whether I still drove at night, whether I remembered to take my medications on schedule, all presented as gentle concern, but delivered with the clipped precision of someone assessing vulnerability. Every answer I gave, each calm, measured assertion that I was capable and self-sufficient, seemed to unsettle her further, as though her newfound awareness of my independence was not a relief, but an affront. I began to recognize a pattern. She wasn't simply worried. She was trying to reestablish a hierarchy where she stood above me, where she could feel in control of at least one relationship in her unraveling life. Her marriage was collapsing despite the clean paternity result, her husband retreating into a shell of detachment that looked worse on her than suspicion ever had. Her son, now old enough to sense the tension at home, had begun to keep his distance as well. It was as though everyone she had relied upon for validation had stepped away at once, leaving her desperate for any position of power she could reclaim, even if it meant attempting to impose that power on me. One evening, she called in a trembling voice, explaining that she had suggested to her husband that they see a counselor, only for him to dismiss the idea with a shrug and a comment about being too busy to fix something that never really worked to begin with. She spent the entire phone call oscillating between rage and despair, speaking in long, jagged sentences that spilled over each other like water breaching a dam. Yet underneath her panic was a bitterness I had heard before, a resentment that seemed less directed at her husband and more at me, as though my ability to navigate solitude with steadiness was an indictment of her inability to withstand the fractures appearing in her own home. She said, in a tone that was almost accusatory, that she didn't understand how I could have survived all those years raising her alone, how I could have faced grief and hardship without falling apart, how I could sit in my quiet house and seem of all impossible things. Content. It was not admiration. It was something closer to envy, the kind that carries the sharpness of accusation when it cannot be admitted plainly. The next day she arrived on my doorstep without warning, her face drawn and pale, her hands clenched so tightly around the strap of her purse that her knuckles looked bloodless. She walked inside and closed the door behind her with more force than necessary, standing in the center of the room like a woman bracing for impact. She announced, without preamble, that she had spoken to a friend who worked in elder care, who insisted that aging parents often hid their vulnerabilities out of pride, and she demanded to know whether I was being honest about my health, about my finances, about my daily life. I listened, surprised but not shaken, as she went on, building momentum, each sentence more urgent and sharp than the last. She said it was irresponsible of me not to involve her in my plans, that the burden of my future might fall on her shoulders unexpectedly, that families needed transparency, that I was being stubbornly secretive. The tirade grew more aggressive, her words rolling together like stones thrown downhill, until I finally raised a hand to quiet her. I told her that my life was not a burden she was expected to carry, that every decision I had made in the past decade was shaped by the knowledge that I had no one to rely on but myself, that I had grown used to standing alone, not out of pride, but out of necessity. I reminded her, gently but firmly, that she had made it clear long ago that my presence complicated her world, that she had chosen a life that included me only in the narrowest, most superficial ways. Her reaction was immediate and explosive. She stepped back as though I had struck her, her eyes filling with that familiar blend of anger and wounded pride, and she accused me of punishing her, of holding on to old grievances, of refusing to let her make amends. It was astonishing, that ability she had to flip the narrative so quickly, to cast herself as the victim, even as she tried to pry open the doors of a life she had kept sealed shut for so long. I told her I was not punishing anyone, that my boundaries were not spite, but survival, that forgiveness was not a switch I could flip simply because she had decided she finally wanted something from me. That is when something inside her snapped. She began pacing the room, her voice rising, her hands gesturing wildly as she spoke about how her husband blamed her for everything, how her friends were drifting away, how her son barely spoke to her anymore, how her entire life felt like it was collapsing no matter what she did. And then she said the words that revealed more than she intended. I can't lose control of one more thing. I stood still, absorbing the confession, and understood at last that this escalation, this frantic attempt to measure, manage, and dismantle parts of my life, had nothing to do with me. I was simply the last place she believed she might still be able to regain control, the last person she could try to reshape through demands and guilt, the last relationship where she could imagine herself still holding authority. The storm inside her grew darker after that realization, and the next days carried an uneasiness that settled over my house like a film of dust. She began showing up without calling, sometimes early in the morning, sometimes after sunset, always with some flimsy excuse about needing to check on something or return something trivial. She walked through my home with a tense, hypercritical eye, noting how high the top shelf was, how many stairs I climbed, how I should think about downsizing, how my neighborhood was getting too isolated, as though every observation were a thread she could use to pull me closer to dependence. And when I did not react the way she hoped, when I met her observations with calm indifference, she grew visibly agitated. The breaking point of this second escalation came on a day heavy with humidity, when the sky seemed bruised with the promise of a storm that refused to break. She arrived unannounced again, her posture rigid, her face set with the cold determination of someone who had convinced herself she was doing the necessary thing, regardless of the cost. She sat down across from me and announced that she had spoken to a lawyer about what would happen when I could no longer make decisions for myself. My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to stay composed. She went on explaining that she had inquired about power of attorney, guardianship, medical proxies, all in a tone that suggested she believed she was being responsible rather than intrusive. She spoke quickly, as though she feared losing her own resolve, and when she finally paused for breath, she looked at me with an expression that was almost a challenge, waiting to see whether I would resist or crumble. I told her, with a steadiness I felt down to my bones, that I had already designated someone years ago, a neighbor I trusted with my life, a woman who had stood by me through my darkest days, and that all the legal paperwork had been filed long before. Her sudden reappearance, the shock on her face was almost visceral. She demanded to know why I hadn't told her, why I would choose someone outside the family, why I would exclude her from decisions that she insisted should be her responsibility. I looked at her, and for the first time since she had returned, allowed the full weight of the truth to leave my lips without softening it. I told her that family is not defined by blood, but by presence, by the hands who hold you when you fall, by the voices who stand with you when the world falls silent, and that for more than a decade she had not been present in my life in any meaningful way. I told her that I had chosen someone who had not discarded me, someone who had shown up even when there was nothing to gain, someone who knew the shape of my days and the rhythm of my fears. I told her that decisions about my life belonged to those who had lived beside me, not those who had only recently rediscovered my existence out of panic and crumbling pride. She stared at me with a rawness that was almost painful to witness. For the first time, she was not angry. She was afraid, not of my independence, but of the reflection of herself she saw in the truth I had spoken. She whispered that she had always assumed she would be the one to make decisions for me someday, that she had believed it was her duty, her right, her eventual redemption. But I shook my head. Redemption was never a burden I would place on her shoulders, nor a currency I would trade for my autonomy. It was then, in that suspended moment where everything between us felt stripped to its barest form, that she began to cry. Not the sharp sobs of earlier, but a deep, keening cry that came from the center of a life cracking open. She said she didn't know who she was anymore, that nothing in her life made sense, that she felt as though she were running through a burning house, trying to put out flames with her bare hands. She begged me to understand that she was drowning, that she needed something solid to hold on to, that she was terrified of becoming invisible in her own story. And I understood more deeply than she realized, because I had once lived in that same desperate place, begging for acknowledgement from people incapable of giving it. But I also knew that her desperation could not become the architecture of my life. I told her, gently but without compromise, that she needed help, real help, the kind I could not provide. She resisted at first, shaking her head, insisting that she just needed time, that things would settle, that she could fix everything on her own. But I reminded her of the truth she had spoken unguarded earlier. She could not lose control of one more thing, and control, I said, is not the same as healing. She left my house that evening more quietly than she had arrived, closing the door with a soft click instead of a slam. I watched her walk to her car, her shoulders curled inward, her steps uncertain. And for the first time I felt, not anger, not vindication, but a sorrow so deep it ached in my ribs. Not sorrow for myself. I had long since learned to carry my own grief with grace. But sorrow for her. A woman who had spent her life valuing the wrong things, who had traded truth for appearance, love for approval, dignity for the illusion of superiority, and who now found herself standing in the ruins of a life that had been beautiful only from far away. She would return again, of course she would, but the next time she did, she would bring with her something I never expected, something that would tilt the balance between us once more, not toward reconciliation, but toward a reckoning neither of us could postpone any longer. She came back on a morning so still and bright that it felt almost deliberate, as though she had chosen a day the world would not dare to disturb, A day when even the wind seemed unwilling to interfere with whatever she believed had to happen between us. When I opened the door, she stood there, holding a thin folder against her chest, her fingers pressed so tightly to its edges that the paper inside was already bending. She looked smaller somehow, not in height, but in presence, as though some essential weight had finally shifted from her shoulders and landed somewhere she could no longer carry it. She stepped inside slowly, scanning the room the way someone does when they know they are about to ask for something that may not be granted. She didn't sit right away, didn't speak, only walked to the window and stared out at the garden where the first tomatoes of the season were already beginning to ripen. When she finally turned, her voice came out as an almost fragile whisper, but the resolve beneath it was unmistakable. She said she had made a decision, and that this decision was not something her husband knew about, nor something she intended to discuss with anyone else. She said the night after our last conversation, after she had cried in the car until she could no longer see the road, she had realized that she had reached the end of whatever version of her life she had been pretending to hold together. And then she placed the folder on the table between us, sliding it forward with a trembling hand, urging me to look inside. When I opened it, the first thing I saw was a document with her signature at the bottom, written in the same sweeping, hurried handwriting she had used since she was a teenager, the handwriting that once filled her school notebooks with declarations of the future she believed she deserved. The document was a sworn statement, notarized, outlining in unflinching detail the truth she had kept locked away for more than a decade, the timeline of her infidelity, the reason she had demanded I stay away from her wedding, the fear that I might inadvertently reveal the truth simply by existing in the same room, the shame she felt when her fiancé's family hinted she should manage her relatives more carefully, the cowardice that led her to erase me from the most important day of her life, rather than confront the possibility that I might see something in her that she couldn't bear to face. I read the pages carefully, feeling the heaviness of each line settle into the space between us. But I didn't interrupt her as she continued speaking, her words gathering force the longer she allowed them to exist outside her mind. She explained that she was filing for legal separation, not because of the test results or because of any single argument, but because she had finally understood that she had been living inside a life curated by fear, not by choice. She said her husband had stopped speaking to her except in clipped instructions about bills and schedules, that he had stopped looking at her with even the pretense of affection, that she could not remember the last time she had laughed in his presence without feeling self-conscious. And then she said the words that carried more weight than she realized. She did not want her son to learn from her that love meant suppression, that marriage meant performance, that survival meant accepting emotional starvation as normal. She wanted out, not only for herself, but for him. When she finished, she looked at me with eyes stripped bare of defenses, and for the first time in many years there was no accusation, no resentment, no demand. What I saw instead was a woman who had finally come face to face with the truths she had spent her adult life avoiding. A woman standing on a precipice, not because she had been pushed, but because she had finally stopped running. She said she needed one thing from me, not forgiveness, not approval, but a witness. She needed someone to stand beside her as she submitted the documents, someone who knew the history behind her choices, someone who could attest that she was speaking the truth now, even if that truth was late and imperfect. She said she could not ask her husband's family, she could not tell her friends, and she could not bring herself to appear alone in an office where her entire life would be reshaped by ink and signatures. I sat with her request for a long, quiet minute, letting its full weight settle. It would have been easy to say no, easy to place the burden of the past between us like an immovable wall. Easy to tell her that the woman who once told me I would ruin her wedding did not now deserve my support, as she dismantled the life she had chosen instead of me. But the truth, the deep truth that lives beneath pride and old wounds, is that I had spent too many years believing that my voice no longer had value, and there was something profoundly grounding in the realization that I could choose not from obligation or guilt, but from clarity. I told her I would come, not because I was responsible for rescuing her, not because her journey toward accountability absolved the pain she had caused me, but because this moment was the first time she had acted not from fear, but from honesty. And I wanted, perhaps needed, to witness that transformation for myself. Her reaction was immediate and almost startling. Her shoulders dropped, and for a moment she seemed unable to speak. When she finally found her voice, she admitted that she had expected me to refuse, that she had rehearsed every possible argument in her head on the drive over, that she had braced herself for rejection because it was what she believed she deserved. She told me in a shaking whisper that she was afraid to start her life over, that she did not know what she would do after the separation was finalized, that she feared losing not only her marriage, but her identity, and that the only thing that steadied her was the possibility, small, quiet, fragile, that she might build something real from the ashes. She said she did not know if I would ever be part of that future, but she wanted to try, even if the trying began with nothing more than paperwork and the trembling courage of someone stepping out of a life that had become too tight to breathe in. The next morning, we drove together to the attorney's office, the silence in the car thick but not hostile. She watched the passing landscape with a kind of stunned attentiveness, as though seeing the world in new colors, and there was something almost childlike in her posture, something that reminded me of how she used to sit in the back seat on long drives when she was small, her forehead pressed to the window, searching for shapes in the clouds. When we arrived, she hesitated at the entrance, her hand hovering just above the door handle, and I placed my palm gently against her back, not guiding her but steadying her. She inhaled, exhaled, and stepped inside. The appointment was long, the room sterile and cold, the legal jargon swirling around us in impersonal rhythms, but she signed every page with quiet resolve. When the final document was notarized, she let out a breath that sounded like the release of years she had been holding in her chest. Years of pretending, years of shrinking, years of forcing herself into the narrow corridor of a life she believed would validate her worth. When we stepped outside, the sky had deepened into the soft blue of late afternoon, and she stood on the sidewalk staring upward, her face tilted toward the light as though she were seeing it for the first time. She turned to me then and said something I had not expected, something that pierced through the layers of distance that had separated us for so long. She said she knew she could not erase the past. She knew she might never deserve a place in my life again, but she wanted to earn whatever small corner of trust I might someday allow her. She said she didn't come to me because she wanted to be taken care of. She came because she finally understood that truth lived here in a way it never had in her marriage, and she no longer wanted to live in a world built from lies. I looked at her, really looked, and for the first time in many years I saw the woman she could become, not the woman she had been. And I felt a shift inside me. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something like the first draft of peace, the quiet knowledge that sometimes reclamation is not loud or triumphant, but simply the willingness to let the truth stand taller than the hurt. We walked back to the car without speaking, and the silence between us felt different, open, tentative, full of possibility and fracture at once, like a door left lightly ajar. And when I drove her home, watching her step out onto the curb with a steadiness new to her posture, I realized that she had not come to my door seeking salvation. She had come seeking transformation. And in choosing to witness it, I had found a kind of transformation of my own. In the days after I drove her home from the attorney's office, a strange and gentle quiet settled over my life, the kind that arrives only when something long knotted has finally loosened, not undone entirely, but eased enough to let air move through it. I found myself waking earlier than usual, standing on the porch with my cup of tea and feeling the morning sunlight on my face with a clarity I hadn't noticed in years, as though witnessing her step toward truth had illuminated something in me well, I did not wait for her to call, nor did I expect it. And there was a peculiar comfort in that absence of expectation. It felt like standing on solid ground after years of balancing on the thin ice of hope. The silence this time did not ache. It simply existed, still and honest, like a room finally cleared of dust. She did call eventually, not with urgency or trembling or demands, but in a voice that was almost shy, as if she were afraid of interrupting a peace she suspected I had learned to cherish. She said she was settling into the guest room, that her husband had barely acknowledged the separation papers, that her son was confused but stable, that she had begun seeing a counselor who told her that grief sometimes comes not from losing something, but from realizing it was never what you believed it to be. She spoke slowly, choosing her words with care, and for once she did not ask me to solve anything. She was simply telling the truth of her days, small and unpolished, and that alone felt like an unfamiliar kind of closeness between us. I listened, not because she needed me to, but because I could, without losing myself in the process. Her visits became less frequent, but more intentional. She no longer arrived unannounced or with a folder of forms she believed I should complete. Instead, she knocked softly, waited for my answer, and entered only when invited. She often brought nothing with her except her presence, which in its new, quieter form felt like the beginning of something more fragile and authentic than anything we had shared in years. Once she asked if she could sit in the garden with me, and we spent the afternoon pulling weeds in companionable silence, each of us absorbed in our own thoughts, yet somehow aligned in a way that felt deceptively natural, as though this ease had been possible all along if we had both known how to reach for it. One evening, she brought her son with her, a tall, solemn-eyed teenager who hovered near the doorway as though unsure whether he belonged in the house of a grandmother he barely knew. She introduced us with a hesitation that revealed how deeply she feared rejection on his behalf, but he stepped forward and shook my hand with a politeness that was almost startling in its sincerity. He told me he had heard I grew tomatoes and asked if he could see them, and I led him outside while she watched us from the kitchen window, her expression caught somewhere between hope and remorse. He asked questions about planting and soil, about how long it took tomatoes to ripen, about which ones tasted sweetest, and I answered each one slowly, letting him guide the conversation. When he finally smiled, shy, crooked, faint, it felt like a tiny door had opened in the wall between our generations, a door neither of us rushed to widen, but one we both acknowledged existed. After they left that night, I sat alone at the kitchen table, and realized that the ache I once carried in my chest had softened into something quieter, like a scar that no longer throbbed when touched. I understood then that the journey we had taken, through estrangement, shame, collapse, and truth, had not delivered us to some grand reconciliation, nor had it erased the years lost between us. But it had created a space in which we could meet one another without armor, without performance, without the old reflexes that had defined our relationship for so long. It was not forgiveness in the traditional sense, not the sweeping absolution she might once have expected, but a more grounded kind of closure, the kind built from steady, unhurried recognition rather than dramatic declarations. I began writing a little more in my journal. Not the fragments of grief I once recorded, but notes about the small rhythms of my days. The sound of the neighbor's dog, the stretch of sunlight across the armchair, the tomatoes ripening one by one. I found myself imagining her future without fear, imagining her living in a home where she could breathe, imagining her son growing into a man who understood love not as performance, but as presence. And sometimes, in rare, soft moments, I imagined her coming to me not because she was drowning, but because she simply wanted to sit with me. Two women who had once walked through separate storms now sharing the quiet after the rain. The last time she visited, she lingered on the porch when she was leaving, her hand resting lightly on the railing as though gathering courage to speak. She said she knew the past still lived between us, not as a weight, but as a landscape we had crossed, rough and uneven. She said she didn't expect anything from me, not promises, not closeness, not certainty, but she hoped one day to be someone I did not brace myself against. I told her that healing was not something that rushed at my age, that trust grew slowly, even in fertile soil, but that I saw her trying, and that mattered more than anything else. She nodded, her eyes shining with an emotion she did not name, and then walked down the steps with a steadiness I had not seen in her before. That night, as I closed the curtains and prepared for sleep, I realized the world felt strangely open, not because the past had been undone, but because I had ceased carrying it as proof of anything. I had acted when it mattered, spoken when it counted, stood firm when I once would have folded, and in doing so, I had reclaimed a part of myself I didn't know I had lost. The silence in my home no longer felt like abandonment. It felt like space. And as I lay beneath the soft hum of the ceiling fan, I thought of all the women who had lived lives shaped by the cruelties of family, by the betrayals of those they had given everything to, by the invisibility that settles like dust over the years, until they forget how much light they once carried. For them, and for the woman I once was, I whispered into the dark. Sometimes the door that closed on you was never meant to be yours in the first place. And sometimes the strength you feared you had lost was simply waiting for you to stop asking for permission to use it.